Thanks for being here tonight. It's wonderful to see so many new faces in the gallery. I really appreciate that and very excited about this discussion this evening. I wanted to say a couple things. I wanted to thank Angela P. For helping me make this happen and being willing to open your team up to being a part of this panel, so really appreciate that. This is All Else Pales 2. We did All Else Pales 1 in 2022. That featured a single artist or a single painter who had teamed up with a scientist to on his sketching of his paintings and working back and forth between a physicist and climate change and his paintings to sort of vet his ideas in his artwork. We then had that scientist come in and look at the artwork and talk about the science behind the artwork. And it was at that point that I thought, oh, that's really sort of cool. And it really is the impetus for doing this a second time, and a more robust time is trying to figure out all sorts of different ways where we can cross-pollinate different disciplines and passions about the environment in conversation and dialogue in art, poetry, and science. You guys are really a critical part of that conversation, so thank you for being a part of this. I feel really lucky tonight to have Peter Crawley here to moderate this event. Peter and I were neighbors in East Cambridge, right down the street from MIT and Harvard, and for about 20 years. And when I mentioned that he was doing this, he goes, I'd love to moderate that panel. And I thought it was a generous offer, so thank you. And Peter has had about 20 years experience being a consultant in the world of sustainability in and around Boston, and probably beyond that. You've got your master's from Harvard in sustainability and his master's from Columbia in development. So he's bringing some chops to the game here. So I feel very honored to have you here, so thank you. And I'm not going to get in the way very much for that, but thank you for being here. Thank you all, and enjoy.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. Paul's been away from Cambridge for about 8 years now, and this is the first time I've seen his studio and all that he's created, and I'm just warning you, I'm definitely going to try to get him back to Cambridge. So we need people to create community like this, and you're very lucky to have him here. So thank you, Paul, for inviting me. So this evening we're going to have an open conversation after some remarks by our three guests from the University of Cincinnati. And the topic is about the intersection of the arts and science, in particular within the context of climate change. And how can those two disciplines inform each other? How can they empower each other to help you comprehend climate change, help you process it, and help you react to it? So we all know what climate change is, and we've seen the many warnings. And one of the things I think we're going to explore tonight is what effective messaging about climate change is to win hearts, minds, and action, and what ineffective messaging is. And in my preparation for this, I did a little searching, and if you just search on climate change, you do get many lists of the top 10 key issues of climate change. And I just want to share one with you that I came across as an example of how we're messaged about it and where it leaves us after that messaging. And I think we're going to explore alternative ways of talking about it. So this is titled 10 Key Facts About Climate Change. 1, global temperatures are rising. 2, sea levels are rising. 3, extreme weather events are increasing. 4, ocean acidification. is happening. 5, Arctic sea ice is declining. 6, snow cover is decreasing. 7, human activities are the main driver. 8, climate change impacts food availability. 9, wildlife populations are declining. 10, the time for action is now. Well, after reading that, you need, a prescription for Prozac, right? And you never want to leave your house. So I think what we're going to talk about tonight is an alternative way of understanding it. I mean, both art and science are about understanding our environment and then expressing it, teaching it to others. So we have some experts here on this topic, and I'd like to introduce the first speaker. They'll speak for about 10 minutes. We'll have a little bit of moderated conversation whereby panelists can ask the speaker, and I'm going to ask some follow-on questions, and then at the end we're going to open it up to all of you. So our first speaker is Kate Nicole Hoffman. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cincinnati. She's affiliated with both the Department of Philosophy and the Center for Public Engagement with Science. Her research focuses on understanding and reimagining the human-nature relationship in a contemporary world marked by environmental destruction. Central to her work is the concept of reciprocity, which she highlights as essential for building a healthier environmental future. Kate is also active in music, theater, and dance, and is constantly exploring new ways to connect the arts with environmentalism. So I'm very grateful and interested in your thoughts on this topic.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm so pleased, excited to be here, to see the studio and to meet all of you and to be with these esteemed panelists. And thank you for the introduction. I guess I thought maybe for my bit of time here, I'd tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and where I'm at now. Early in the journey, still as a postdoc, but I did my undergraduate degree in classical voice. I've always been really active in music and theater, and I dance too. I'm not very good at it, but I do try to dance. I have my PhD actually in philosophy. I sort of moved a slightly different way, and the philosophy I was interested in was in environmental philosophy and also thinking about sort of animal ethics. So really interested in this, as Peter said, this relationship between humans and the non-human world in all of its different forms. And for a while, those kind of parts of my life felt pretty separate. I was like doing the arts thing over here, and I was doing the philosophy, environmental thing over here. But I had some opportunities kind of later in my PhD to see these worlds come together, and now I've had even more opportunities to bring these worlds together. And I guess, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I guess one of the original things that made me think it'd be a good idea to bring these things together is that having grown up in the arts, and I'm sure this is the case for many of you here too, I really recognize the power of art to make you feel connected and empowered and to grapple with issues that are really challenging and that intersect with your identity and with emotions, and you're not really sure how to feel about it, all these kinds of things. And I think for me, climate change and a lot of these environmental issues are bring that up for me, where I can feel isolated and disconnected and powerless, and I'm not sure where my emotions are supposed to fit into it. So I thought, I wonder if I can, in small ways, bring what I know from the arts together and make, again, in some small ways, sort of make progress. And I guess one way I started to do this was to think about, so one thing that struck me when you were reading the list of the top 10 things, besides the fact that they make you feel like stressed, is that there are these big kind of global issues, which of course climate change is. But I think sometimes what's really tricky about climate change is that you can you may not feel it happening right around you, right? It's happening very gradually. It's this long-term complex issue. It's global. You hear about the polar bears are dying, or the this or the that, and you're wondering, well, how does that affect me here in Cincinnati, and what do I have to do with it, and how am I sort of a part of this? And I think that's especially true for people in kind of city environments. So I did my PhD in Philadelphia. Another, you don't think of that as a natural environment paradise. But I was really interested, maybe you do, but I was really interested in, well, can I start to see, can I start to notice the animals and the plants and the environment around me in the way that I do when I go to a national park, or I spent some time in the Galapagos, and there it's so easy to feel like nature, and then to feel sort of the gravitas of climate change in a way that in some of these other locations you might not. So I started working on some kind of workshops using creative methods to help people think in different ways about their environmental future, using some techniques I learned in improv, and I collaborated with a poet actually, with techniques she learned as a creative writer, to see if we could use those to sort of shake people up in different ways and help them to think about the future in different ways. So that was really interesting. I did an environmental theater project in the Galapagos, where we were working with kids to turn stories about Galapagos's humans and environment, sort of stories at the intersection of that, turn them into these little plays that they could then perform for their community. And it was awesome and a ton of fun. But then when I came here to Cincinnati, I thought, well, why does it just have to be in the Galapagos? Here I have this whole thing about cities as, places of nature. And so I'm really excited now to be working with Carol Bramer, who's also part of the show. We have a theater project where we're going to be taking stories about Cincinnati's environmental history and turning that into a play, which I'm really excited about. So stay tuned. So maybe just the last thing I'll say, as by way of introduction, is so now I'm a postdoc at the Center for Public Engagement with Science. It gives me a really amazing opportunity to be combining, this kind of art stuff with the environment and science, and then with, thinking about public engagement and bringing people together to work on these kinds of things. And one thing that I've learned being part of this center is that getting people to think about climate change or the environment or science or whatever is not just a matter of shoving a bunch of facts down their throat, right? It's actually, it's a much more complex kind of engagement, and it involves trust and identity and storytelling and all these other kinds of things. So it's been a real treat for me to get to explore that, and I'm hoping to continue to do that in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, Kate Nicole, I wonder if you can give us a sense of the flavor of some of the stories that through your theater, your spontaneous theater, some of the stories that are told, and some of the participants, clearly they're not professionals, they're ordinary folks that are, I think, participating in this.
Yeah.
Give us a sense of some of the stories that evolved, and who the actors and actresses are.
Totally. Well, so I can say for the Cincinnati project, we're just starting to get things off the ground. So I can say what we're imagining for that, and I can also say a little bit in the Galapagos case. But I think for me and Carol, we want to think about stories about Cincinnati's environment really quite broadly, and in the sense that I think everyone has a story to tell. So we're not just looking for experts in Cincinnati's history, professors at UC, although I've been talking to some of them too, but also people who've had an intimate moment with a bird that they really love, that they see out their window. I think that's a human environmental connection, or someone who experienced change in their backyard over time, given whatever. or someone who participated in a protest because of some environmental justice issue. All these kinds of things, I think, we want to elevate those stories and those storytellers so that people can hear those stories and think in a different way about the spaces around them and about their own interactions with the birds or whatever it may be, you know. So we're wondering what will fall out of that, but we're thinking pretty broadly. In the Galapagos case, one of the ways that started actually was that I was there for other kinds of, working on other projects, and I was talking to people there about, just as a side thing, asking how they felt about living in the Galapagos. Oh, this amazing place, and what do you feel your relationship to the island? And I was really surprised that some people told me they felt like there was no real relationship there at all. And I said, why might that be? And some people said there are no stories. They actually said it in that way. There aren't stories that ground us to the land, because the population on Galapagos is relatively recent. It doesn't stretch back. The human population in Galapagos, it doesn't stretch back so far. So they expressed it in that way, and immediately, my little theater kid mind, stories. And so then we sort of got to work together in thinking about that. But that moment really inspired me, because I think that stories are very powerful in connecting you with place. And I even, my family comes from Buffalo, New York. Again, not a place of nature, beautiful nature. But they've lived there for a couple generations, and that's true. There is beautiful nature there. That's right. And I love Buffalo.
Niagara Falls.
That's right.
One of the most beautiful places in North America.
That's true. Thank you. See, I get defensive about people come at me about Buffalo, but now I have a supporter.
We don't have a coastline here.
That's true. So I guess there are those stories, but even stories that are not necessarily related to Niagara Falls, even though those would be wonderful stories, I feel like hearing stories about my family from there connects me to that place in just a remarkable way, even though it's the time Uncle Joe tripped down the stairs and whatever, but I just feel connected to that place in a different way. So I think that's the power of stories.
And once you feel connected, what are the benefits of that?
Yeah, well, so one thing to say is it's definitely not true that as soon as you feel connected to a place, you're automatically galvanized into climate action or environmental action or anything like that. There's more to it, a lot more to it. But I do think that there's something really important about connecting to the environments around you, so that you feel the problem and the task of reorienting sort of our relationship to nature is not something that exists out there and not as part of you or your life or your neighborhood or whatever else. And so, this is not to say that it's just as easy as, getting people to notice, but I think getting people to notice and feel that connection is a part of it.
Sure.
It's the part that maybe I can give my small contribution to. That's the goal.
Both Kate Nicole and I have spent time in Ecuador, and like Native Americans in North America, the indigenous people of Ecuador have called plants, animals, rocks as relatives. That they have a familial relationship with these things, these sentient beings. And it really does change your care for them. Mm-hmm. If you love them, you will steward them and you will care for them. So that connection is really important. But I wanted to ask you one last question, and that is, because you're our resident performer, and you are part of the creative process when you're doing theater or dancing and singing, and you're doing it in a group context. Mm-hmm. What what happens in those groups that might be very beneficial to building some kind of movement or solidarity amongst people, even if they are of very different political persuasions, let's say.
Yeah.
Do you see that happen through group creative activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do, and I'd like to see even more of it, but I think that creating art together in groups requires a kind of vulnerability, first of all, that is really special. It can be scary, you know, for people. And so, you know, doing the little workshops and stuff, I'm not asking people to bare their souls or anything like that, but like, you know, you're being asked to not just talk about the facts or whatever, but sort of open a piece of yourself up in this process of building a story together or exploring something together. And I think and then there's other things where you're working with other people so you don't feel so alone, and different people will have different ideas, so you can come up with something greater. But I don't know, just as you said that in the moment, thinking about that aspect of vulnerability and how sometimes when I think about climate change, to me, you know, it's not just a scientific issue, although of course it is, and it's not just a, you know, communication issue, although of course it is, or not just an artistic issue, although of course it is, but also there's something that's like deeply existential and personal, and I think to grapple with it means you have to allow yourself to be a little bit vulnerable in these ways, and so exploring that in a kind of group context, I think, again, I don't think it's going to solve the world, but I think there's like something there that I'm interested in exploring.
And it's a universal threat. It's the same threat for Republicans as Democrats. It's
Right.
you know, it's a existential threat for everyone. So it connects us at a level of a humanity level, a universal level. So that can often be helpful to get beyond the little stuff.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now we will move to more of a physical scientist as opposed to a social scientist. We're lucky to have Dr. Amy Townsend Small with us. She's a professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Townsend Small's research centers on the environmental impacts of the oil and gas industry, with experience advising on greenhouse gas emission reduction policies and a recent role as senior climate advisor in the U.S. Department of State. Her expertise bridges science and policy. So, Dr. Townsend Small, would you like to share some observations with us?
Sure, yeah. I guess my first thing I want to say is in your top 10 list, just as Kate Nicole said, my takeaway was it didn't say the number one cause of climate change is fossil fuels, and that's one thing I always try to emphasize when I talk to groups. Fossil fuels are the main cause of climate change. Just need to stop using them, and that's the solution. So we know exactly what to do. It's not a scientific problem anymore, it's a political problem. Maybe a communication problem. Not sure about that. Political solution is possible. We've had a few in this country that we've gone backward and forward on political solutions. So yeah, and that's what I work on is mostly methane emissions from the oil and gas supply chain. CO2 emissions don't really need that many measurements anymore because we just know exactly what they are and where they are from burning fossil fuels. Methane's a more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2's. How many people here know what methane is? Okay, good. Some people know what it is. When you guys hear about methane, you think about a cow? Okay, good. Methane is the primary component of natural gas. So natural gas can be up to 95% methane. And that's what you cook with maybe at your house, maybe use it to heat your hot water. And a lot of our power plants in the United States use natural gas to create electricity. More and more these days, since around 2010, when the United States started doing a process called fracking. You might have heard of it. And so now, since then, we've become the #1 producer in the world, biggest country in the world for producing oil and natural gas, which both come from the fracking process. So the more you take natural gas out of the ground to use, the more it leaks. And so emissions of methane, since it's a more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2, especially right after it's emitted, it's most powerful right after it's emitted, that's accelerating climate warming. So the more natural gas we use, the faster the Earth is heating up. So that's what I work on, and as you just heard, I work with policymakers closely, especially to identify like low-hanging fruit for emissions reduction. So yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah. Luckily, thanks for doing that.
And I also work on other things I've done, like health impacts of using and burning natural gas to see if that's like something people would galvanize around too.
Can you describe the technology behind some of the satellite imaging of where?
We do ground measurements, like on the ground measurements. There are some very high-tech satellites now for measuring the biggest methane emitters.
Right.
Yeah, like landfills. Very large emitting oil and gas wells, or like broken transmission pipelines. Those are the things satellites can detect. The hope is detecting them could lead to reducing emissions. We'll see.
Amy, if you could just wave a wand and change one thing in the policy-making process, what would it be?
I'm not a policy-making expert. I've worked to give policymakers scientific facts to help them create policy. I guess from my limited background, I guess I would say make executive orders, not wash them away in the US.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe that. Or, yeah, I mean, in the US, you know, we're party to the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is from the early 90s. And we've had a few attempts at limiting greenhouse gas emissions since the United States signed the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
The first was called the Clean Power Plan. That was in the Obama administration. After President Trump was elected the first time, Supreme Court said the Clean Power Plan is, I don't know, unconstitutional, I guess. And then now we have the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't know what's going to happen with that. We'll see.
Right.
Yeah, that's our current plan for reducing emissions under the Paris Agreement. But of course, we're not party to the Paris Agreement anymore again.
Right. So protecting from one person or one party's ability to unwind a policy that made sense would clearly be a good reform.
I guess, can I change my answer?
Yes.
I guess maybe limiting oil companies' ability to pay for political campaigns. That's probably the best one.
which ties into the whole problem of misinformation. And I remember an earlier conversation you and I had about the frustrations and fighting the misinformation that's out there. And you're producing in a very diligent way what, we might call facts around, scientific facts around the impacts of a certain toxin. And yet, when that data is pushed out into the public realm, it may be spun in a very different way.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about that? And
Yeah, I've had a lot of run-ins with oil and gas companies and aligned politicians in my career, even before it was popular, which is, I guess, now. So, yeah, it's just a stressful road.
From our prior conversations, I also know how courageous you've been to continue to kind of speak the truth about the science of climate change. And I wonder if you could...
Well, there's no other choice.
Well, there are.
Like
People
what?
lie about it all the time.
Not scientists.
I hope that's true.
I mean, there's maybe a couple of University of Scientists that are paid by oil and gas companies that lie.
Sure.
But no, not scientists all know the truth.
So, you have been kind of pressured personally, and some of your funding, you were telling me, had been either reduced or cut, both during the first Trump administration and this, I think you were expecting it in this administration. How do you process that personally, like emotionally and intellectually, given how much you've invested in your career and the, like you said, the integrity of the scientific process and the institution? How do you process that?
I mean, it's very stressful.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how I process it other than I don't know.
Have you joined any groups to protest that, or what are what's happening at some of the university levels and amongst scientists, for instance, to try to protect data, to protect reports, to keep the message honest?
I wouldn't say our university is that caring about the issue, not in the environmental field. It's not a big component of our university's portfolio of research funds, I guess, to be fair. They have a lot of medical and health research. That's the biggest component of their funding.
Yeah.
I guess what I've done over the years is gotten more and more involved with policymakers and talking to them at all levels. So I worked at the State Department for a year, and I meet regularly with all policymakers at all levels, like from local to international, to talk to them about this topic. So that's, I think, in my opinion, the way you can make the biggest impact. Some are open to hearing more and learning more, and some aren't. But.
Do you think there can be almost a shadow climate data repository and research, function under certain universities if the federal government is ceasing to do this, like, the national climate assessment that the Trump administration is dissolving?
There'll never be enough money to replace what's the federal government is taking away.
Yeah.
They might be able to save some of the data that's being deleted from websites, but the United States federal government has been such a amazing funder of research over the years. There's no other country like it in the world.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's not just university level research. They have their own research institutes too. So that's irreplaceable.
And my last question for you is, we talked a little bit about Silent Spring and Rachel Carson's book, back in 1962 about the impacts of DDT and how effective that was in changing, public opinion and regulation around DDT and pesticides in general. What do you think could play a similar role in our battle with greenhouse gases? Is that a model, or do you see any kind of piece of work, whether it be a combination of art and science or politics and science, that might get traction?
I don't know. I don't know. Actually, I was wondering when you were talking, Kate Nicole, when you think about impacts of climate change, do you mostly think about impacts to wildlife and plants, or do you ever think about it's killing people?
Yeah, I mean, I do, but it's in part because I'm trying to think about it in this more localized kinds of ways, versus just the polar bears dying. To me, the impacts of climate change affect the non-human world, and our result are actually, a poor relationship with the planet, but also a poor relationship with each other and other humans. And it's also obviously deeply affecting humans around the world and in these spaces. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
I mean, I thought Hurricane Sandy would be the red line.
Yeah.
And no one did anything. And then Hurricane Maria, 5,000 people plus died. Americans. But I don't know. I don't want to be a doomsday person. I just don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, thank you so much.
When people are dead, I just don't know. But
well, I think that's an excellent segue.
yeah.
because it's easy to come to that conclusion, isn't it? I mean, the facts in a linear way, a logical way, absolutely lead you to that place of despair and apocalypse, and how can we possibly get out of this? But I know from prior conversations that our next speaker, Abel Gustafson, who's an assistant professor of public relations and environmental communication at the University of Cincinnati, has some ideas about how to talk about this, how to communicate in a way that doesn't lead you, and then leave you in that place of despair. And so I'm going to tell you a little more about him before we let him share some of his lessons learned. Dr. Gustafson's research delves into psychology, persuasion, and behavior concerning science, the environment, and technology. With postdoctoral experience at Yale's program on climate change communication, he brings valuable insights into public opinion and strategic communication about sustainability and climate change, which is, boy, do we need him. So, Abel.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here and joining us, and all of you too. Yeah, there's a lot to do on an evening, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us. So I want to talk about three things. So I have 10 minutes, so I'll keep it as efficient as I can. So I'm going to organize this into 3 main points. And the 3 things that I find through all the work that we've been doing studying psychology, public opinion, behavior change, how to communicate effectively on climate and other issues, the 3 main things that we're looking at are ways in which we're actually talking about climate change in a counterproductive or maladaptive way. And I'm not talking about people that are like denying the existence of climate change or saying it's a hoax. I'm talking about people that are advocating for change, that are saying, hey, we should be making a difference on this issue. We should be taking action. We should be changing policy. Oftentimes when we have those good intentions, we're actually talking about these issues in ways that are counterproductive. So we'll talk about 3 main ways, and I call them polar bears, politics, and the apocalypse. So let's talk about polar bears first. So a few years ago, they were doing this big survey, and they were trying to find out, what do people think of when they first hear of climate change? So they just asked people a simple open-ended question in the survey, like, what's the first thing you think of? What's the first thing that comes to mind? And the most common answer in response to this survey question was polar bears. The second most common was melting sea ice. Okay, so that sounds pretty natural because we see this all over. Whenever we see, you know, a nonprofit, hey, donate to our climate cause, whatever, you see an image of a polar bear or maybe melting sea ice or maybe a polar bear floating on some melting sea ice, right? The problem with that, though, is that we start to think about this issue as being a polar bear issue or as being a melting sea ice issue rather than being like a human issue or something that actually affects us like here in our own neighborhoods. And it's actually that kind of issue as well, but most people don't think of it like that. So one of the things that we need to do is to start reframing this issue. Instead of talking about atmospheric CO2 levels and polar bears and melting ice, we need to start talking about the effects of climate change that are happening in our own neighborhoods right now, or the ways that it affects our loved ones, or it affects people around us that we actually care about. Because honestly, that's what we're wired to care about. We're not wired to care about invisible, distant, abstract things. That's our lowest priority, in fact. You can try as hard as you want, and you're not going to get people to care about something that's slow-moving, invisible, far away, and hard to understand. Our brains are wired to care about stuff like, where are we going to get our next meal? How are we going to get our genes into the next generation? What was that sound in the bushes behind us? Like, that's the stuff that like really triggers us into caring a lot. And until we can reframe climate change into something that's more close to home, more tangible, and like really strikes us in a place that activates our priorities, we're just not going to motivate a lot of action. That's just the way it works. So we need to be able to start reframing into those kinds of things. In fact, when I heard that list that you read of the 10 things, it was all of the things that I would say to avoid talking about. Every single one. The first 9 were all like atmospheric sea level, melting sea ice, all these like abstract, distant, hard to understand things. And then number 10 was, we need to take action right away. It's like, well, that doesn't really follow. Number 10 doesn't really follow from the first 9 in most of our minds. Okay, so that's the polar bears issue. The second big problem that we see is the politics issue. It's really, really tempting for us to talk about climate change as often as possible in the language of politics. To say it's our side versus their side. Oh, did you hear what their side did? Oh, did you hear what our side is trying to do? We were trying to do this thing and then the other side stopped us. And I know that those things are true and those things are happening. For sure, those are some of the biggest barriers. Political barriers are one of the main reasons why we aren't able to take action. But it doesn't mean we always have to talk about this issue through those lenses, especially if we're trying to communicate across the aisle, especially if we're trying to resonate with a more diverse group of people or build a bigger tent. Because honestly, that's the only way we're going to make meaningful, wide-scale action is if we build a bigger tent, if we bring more people into it, not if we shrink it and say, hey, you can't play with us unless you talk exactly like us, think exactly like us, and do exactly what we say. That's not a recipe for widespread support. That's a recipe for like shrinking your tent and closing everybody else out. So we have to be careful. Of course we want to recognize these political barriers and overcome them, and they are very real, but it doesn't mean we always have to use that lens or that frame when talking about it. There's a lot of other ways that we can talk about climate change that appeal to motives and concerns that we all share. For example, we can talk about some basic shared values like, hey, we should leave the earth better than we found it. Wouldn't it be great to give a better earth to our children? Wouldn't it be great to protect some of these like basic things that we all value, like clean air and clean water? Wouldn't it be great to have energy independence? There's all these things that like appeal to many different kinds of people and their values and their concerns. And that's like a tiny sliver of the way that we often talk about climate. We're usually talking about it in either, hey, it's going to have this huge negative effect on something very far away that we don't really care about, or we're talking about it because it's this big political scandal that we're all wrapped up in and we're trying to defeat the other team. Neither of those are really going to inspire action from a broader group of people. It might resonate with a narrow group of people, but not a broader group. Okay, so one good way to do this is to reframe climate change into like using these other types of appealing to like these shared motives and values. And we've seen a lot of success in this. We've developed these ads that have people from different types of backgrounds communicate about climate change through these lenses. For example, we recorded a video of Catherine Hayhoe, who's a Christian climate scientist. She's the wife of an evangelical pastor in Texas. She talks about how taking action on climate change is so important to her faith. We also recorded a video of this retired 3-star Air Force general talking about how climate change is a national security concern. And then we also have videos from like Bob Inglis, who talks about how climate change aligns with his conservative values. He's a former congressperson. So we recorded these videos, we deployed them as ads, and we found that when we deployed them in 2 different congressional districts, one in Missouri and one in Georgia, over the course of 30 days, we were able to change public opinion among Republicans on climate change. By 10 percentage points in 30 days, we boosted the percent of Republicans that thought that climate change was a big problem and was also personally important to them. So if we have targeted messaging, if we're like, okay, what is your values? Let's listen honestly and say, what do you actually care about? And then we appeal to that, this actually can work. What doesn't work is if we use our values to try to talk across the aisle. Or if we say, hey, you should care about this thing that you actually don't care about, and I'm just going to try to reorient your entire brain to care about that. And that's just not going to work, right? That's a failed cause. Okay, so that's the politics side. And then lastly, with the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about apocalypse. One of our main tendencies, and this has been true for the last like 30 years of environmental communication, not just on climate, but tons of other things. One of our main tendencies is to focus exclusively on doom and gloom. And the assumption has been for decades that, hey, if we just scare people enough, they're going to take action. It turns out that none of the social psychology or behavioral science research supports that. In fact, it shows the exact opposite. If we scare people too much, you know what happens? They change the channel. They bury their head in the sand. Or they might actually believe it. And that is sometimes is worse because then they decide, well, we're doomed. I guess there's no point in taking action. So if we thoroughly convince people that the apocalypse is coming and that we're all doomed, why would you take action? Like, if there's no hope, then there's no reason to take action. So a lot of the research is showing that we actually need 4 components when communicating about something that's like scary and dangerous and we want people to take action. Okay, we call these fear appeals. So when we're trying to motivate people based on fear, we need 4 components. It's kind of like a recipe. The first thing is you need to show them that the fear is significant. We call this threat severity. Like, this thing is really bad. Second thing is we need something called threat salience. This is like, this threat's relevant to you. Because if it was really bad but not relevant to you, then you're probably still not going to care that much. Okay, so we need threat salience, threat severity. But we can't stop there, and that's the problem, is most people have just kind of stopped there. We need 2 more components. One of them is called self-efficacy, and the other one's response efficacy. Okay, so self-efficacy is the belief that you have the ability to do the solution. So if I'm recommending, hey, solve this problem by doing X, you have to believe that you have the capability of doing X. You have to believe that, oh yeah, I can do that, I can accomplish that goal. Okay, and then that last piece, response efficacy, is your belief that the solution is going to be effective. So let's say that you think, I can do it, but it's not going to work, right? Well, then that also would fall apart. So we need all 4 pieces. The threat is severe, it's relevant to us, you have the ability of taking action, and that action is actually going to be effective. And we've been missing those last 2 components mostly. We're like, hey, if we just scare people enough, they'll take action, right? But most people don't even know what to do. Most people don't even think that we can do something. It's this big, invisible, abstract thing happening. All these scientists keep yapping on and on about it, but I don't know, you haven't told me what to do. And so there's no like tangible, clear action that people believe will actually be effective. And we need to be focusing on that. Like, give people some hope and optimism, because then they're motivated to actually do something. Without the hope and the optimism piece, people are just going to be wallowing in their doom and gloom, and nothing's ever going to happen. So those are these 3 main ways in which we've actually been steering in the wrong direction, like kind of falling into these pits a lot when we're communicating about climate change. And hopefully, as we start to course correct a little, we can do it a little better across all 3 of those.
Fascinating. Wonderful. If you were to try to scale that strategy,
Yeah.
how could you scale it, and what channels do you think would be an effective way to put that out into the public realm?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the most persuasive channels that we found is all of you. Just everyday people talking to their friends and family. Because as much as we like to rely on experts or nonprofits or some sort of like big official source to get our information from, for one, they're not trusted by everybody. And then for another, they're never going to reach everybody either. They don't have the ability to like get across to everyone. So some of the most persuasive forms of communication are hearing something from somebody you actually know and trust in your own everyday life. And this is kind of ironic because whenever we talk about like scientific findings, somebody's personal anecdote does not indicate like actual evidence, right? Like somebody saying, well, for me it was actually warm this winter. That doesn't mean that the climate is actually cold this winter. It doesn't mean that the climate is actually getting colder. You have to look at the data overall to show that it's getting warmer. Okay, so anecdotes are not actual data. However, in our minds, personal anecdotes are incredibly persuasive. We actually are very persuaded by hearing somebody in our own neighborhood or our own friend group that we trust tell us that they really care about something or that they really take this thing seriously. That matters a lot more to them than some abstract, impersonal expert showing yet another, set of charts and figures.
Yeah.
That's not going to be as persuasive as everyday people, telling each other from a place of, love and concern and, genuine like trust. Saying, hey, you know what, I really care about this issue, I think we should all do more about it.
So a follow-on question to that, I think, would be, what are the do's and don'ts, and how's the best way to navigate some of those difficult conversations? You may know that the person you're speaking with is perhaps a denier or perhaps not as convinced as you are. Can you give us some lessons and do's and don'ts for navigating those kinds of difficult conversations?
Totally, yeah. I'd say the number one thing is to moderate your expectations. Because imagine this spectrum that people exist on, and there's people all over the spectrum. It's probably normally distributed that, there's a bunch of people in the middle, a few on the ends or whatever. And if you're talking to somebody on one far end of the spectrum and you're on the other, you know what a giant win is? A giant success is to move them from here to here. And that's it, right? And then maybe over time they'll move a little more. And then after a little while, maybe they'll start to distrust the source of information where they've been getting their prior views. And then maybe they'll move a little bit on their own. And then you come back to them 5 years later and oh my gosh, they're in a totally different place. And this has happened to me in my own life. What I don't think works is to assume that, hey, if I defeat them hard enough with the facts, they're gonna move from here to here. That's not gonna happen. Right? And all it's like, nobody's changed their mind because of how hard they lost an argument. It's just not going to happen, right? Like if you get defeated in an argument that hard, you're not going to like, oh my gosh, you were so right. I finally see the light. Thank you so much for educating me. That doesn't happen. What happens is they just like turn the other way and they never talk to you again. Right? So we have to moderate our expectations, treat them as being real humans. Take their views with respect. And that's hard for us to do oftentimes, because even if we vehemently disagree with them and we think that they're coming from a place of, total misinformation, we still have to, they can tell whether or not we respect them as a person. And if we don't, we're never going to be trusted, we're never going to be persuasive, we're never going to be effective in maintaining that relationship, much less, shifting their views on some important issues.
Great. Well said. Great advice. Well, now we'd like to open it to all these intelligent folks and curious folks and see if you have any questions that you'd like to pose for our panel here. A lot of issues that were surfaced. Yes, sir.
So I come at this from the science side. I'm a PhD molecular geneticist, and actually for the last 25 years I've worked in pharmaceutical and biotechnology marketing and marketing research. So have one foot on the biomedical side, one side on the marketing and communication side. And a couple of things that I've learned. One is that scientists are crappy communicators. When it comes, they rely too heavily on facts. And I think what we see in the current media, going all the way back to the COVID epidemic, where Tony Fauci was out there telling us a lot of really good stuff every single day and no one believed them. Okay, so My question really is, given your recent research, which I found actually very interesting and very compelling, there were two things that caught my attention. One was who communicated the message. And in the three different like little scenarios that you gave, none of them were scientists. One was a former military person, one was married to a pastor, and I don't remember.
She's a scientist.
She's a scientist.
Oh, she was, yeah, but her angle was because she was evangelical, not because she was married to a scientist. And I remember the third one, but I forgot the third one, but it wasn't a scientist. So I'd be very interested, one, to understand really who should the communicators be in doing this kind of messaging. And second, which you also pointed out, is you have to give people solutions. If you're expecting people to take some type of action, you have to tell them, here are the things you need to be doing. And it can't only be stop doing this, right? You can't tell everybody, well, the real solution is to sell your car and get an electric vehicle. Okay, there have to be other things that people can do. So if you find the right person to tell folks, give people real actionable things to do, you know, again, I think you can move the needle, and I agree, you can only move it this far, but I think that up to this point, we've really not done a very good job on either of those two things.
Yeah, for sure. Just a quick comment on the sources of information. I think it really depends on your audience. You have to find out who your audience actually trusts. There's no way that it's going to come from us, the communicators. We're not going to pick this effective communicator and then persuade the audience that they're trustworthy or credible. It has to go the other direction. You have to actually understand that community you're talking to and find out who do they trust, and then go through those sources. And that's going to definitely differ depending on your audience. And then regarding the solutions, I think you're right. Like if we say the only solution to this is to totally upend your life, then most people are going to choose to not do that. So we have to be able to give them also a range of solutions, big ones, small ones, etc. Even solutions that might be like a net neutral, like recycling. Like the margin of benefit on recycling is so tiny. It's just infinitesimal. Like I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but I maybe the physical scientists can speak to this, but I've heard that if you recycle an aluminum can and you wash it out with hot water, the electricity generating the hot water negates the benefit of recycling the can.
Okay.
I don't know if that's 100% true, but the truth is probably within a rounding error. Okay? So like the benefit of recycling may actually be greater in the social aspect. And maybe because we're showing people, hey, you can live a sustainable life, you can take these actions, and then they see themselves as more of an environmentally friendly person. Their neighbors see them taking the recycling bin out to the street, etc. Maybe the cascading indirect social effects are greater than the immediate direct effects of that. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying like we need to offer people a lot of like things along that range, small little behaviors as well as big behaviors that can appeal to people across that entire opinion spectrum. People that are willing to update their life in massive ways, and also ways that people can get engaged if they just have like a tiny little shred of emotion or like motivation that's that big. But yeah, I'd love to hear from the other panelists what you think about that too.
I just want to point out, we've got a poster up here that has like 7 or 8 little things, like if everybody in the world deleted 5 spam messages, 5, how much energy that would save. And I forget the statistic, but it's 5 times 7 billion is a lot of electricity saved not storing that. They can power X amount of cars or houses over a year. So there's a number of little facts like that up here that are real low-hanging fruit, such as that. So those are attainable goals one can do,
For sure, yeah.
You know, it seems like I always think you should just bring it down, and if you could get some big-time wrestlers and some NASCAR drivers and some football players and some country singers and some rock singers, and you were just hitting different, and you could just get them to give one message, even if it was as simple as, hey everybody, delete 5 spam messages, and just let that go out and let it not be Just bring it every kind of level. I mean, I'm just picking the ones I just thought of right now, but I could be a nurse, but anybody, just on the most, right there on the most grassroots level, because that is part of what you're saying. But if everybody was all of a sudden, oh, I did hear that message because I heard her say it, but she heard it from so-and-so, I don't know.
Please.
Yeah, if I could learn what the panel thinks about a simplistic solution that we've already attained in that IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed, and the solution was electing the right politicians. I think that's a lot more achievable than trying to, convince everybody.
I mean, I
So that's
also
that's a
agree
political
that
action.
that individual actions won't solve the climate crisis. I think that it has some potential, but we need large-scale solutions, like changing our electricity sources to renewable energy, changing our transportation from fossil fuel-based to public transit and electric vehicles. Unfortunately, that's what's needed. So individual actions are part of it, they will be part of it, but we need more than that. And unfortunately, not all elected leaders need that.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, there was I'm a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and one of the training films, or one of the films from the conference last year, I think, that I watched was a guy talking about convincing, getting political, traction. And basically, climate has to be in the top 3 issues in order for politicians to care. Because politicians, like to your point, they only care about the things that are right here, they don't care about those threats out here. But if we can kind of get the masses, like to Mary's point, to really care in a small way, it becomes bigger and bigger of a personal issue right here at home, then you do want politicians. I mean, but right now it's like everybody's, and I get it, you're kind of like, well, yeah, I want that too, but I'm worried about how to feed my family or whatever,
IRA was passed by all Democrats. It was opposed by all Republicans. The answer is right there.
Yeah. And
I don't mean to be,
Yeah, but to your point about the oil companies, and to your point about communications, it's like if you're, like the oil companies were actually on board for a while, in the early days when, people started noticing what was happening, they were like, oh, okay, and then there was this switch, it's like, oh yeah, that's gonna put us out of business. But how do you combat that? Does anybody have any, what do you do to make them, they have so much money to promote their messages.
Overturn Citizens United, I don't know.
Yeah, well, that would be good. I like that actually.
There was a movement early on to ask them to be the pioneers of the solutions, and therefore they could replace profits with renewable energy versus fossil-based. But that didn't.
Well,
It's always hard for big companies
they
to
did it
change.
360 very quickly.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Gentleman behind you.
Yeah, myself, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was formulating this question as we went to Margaret across the dais, and then we got to the end. But I'm still gonna, and I have to change it, but I'm gonna go back to the original.
Yes.
And this is a grassrootsy one, and this is a science-based one. Not that I want to talk science, but not an experiential one. So anyway, one thing we live in a democracy where everybody's opinion counts as exactly as much as everybody else's opinion. Well, okay, as long as they vote. And people, a lot of people are not passionate about this one way or the other, but they hear the both sides. There's both sides, and we cherish that in this country. Okay, we don't have to debate if that's a good thing or not, but we do. And people hear a little bit from each side, and whether they're disingenuous or false or just talking nonsense, it doesn't really matter because that's what they hear. What disappoints me a lot is when scientists, or not just scientists, excuse me, but advocates fail to address the points brought up by the other side, quote unquote. They do a very poor job. So Jane's citizen sitting out there hears this quote, I'm just going to use the word other side, you know what I mean. Hears the other side and goes, that makes sense, and doesn't really hear a point-by-point address to those issues. Now, you're saying that kind of stuff doesn't matter. There's a lot of people, so, how many pounds of this, that, and the other in the atmosphere. I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with it, but I think for some people that does have an effect, maybe just a small portion, and they do need to hear that. And no, it's not berating, and you point the fact that you're not going to win anybody by telling them win them over by telling them wrong. I'm not talking about the people who are diehard, but the people in the middle who just hear both sides and don't know what to do, but they hear something that makes sense, and they don't hear why it really doesn't make sense to them. So I don't know if there's a question. There's a lot of various issues in there. Make whatever question you want out of it.
I think the communication strategies have to differ depending on the audience, for sure. We have, so I think the original question when I was talking about that was, like, how do you convince somebody that is, really opposed to this, and, is, this person who's going to debate you about whether it's, even real or not. And that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of, like, managing your expectations and, maintaining that relationship and trying to move them, just a little with it all. But yeah, there's a lot of people in the middle who, have generally positive views. They're like, okay, sure, I feel like I've heard that before. It's never once been a priority for me, but I guess I don't disagree or anything. I guess it's, probably real, it's probably happening. Like, for them, definitely, they need information about how scientists are up in arms about this, how they actually, they don't need to be convinced that it's real. They need to be shown that it's a higher priority than they're currently thinking.
And I'm saying, perhaps you don't agree with that, that's fine. Please say so. That they also hear these other points, which stick with them.
Yeah, for sure.
And those things have to be, it's a better word, debunked.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
So there's a lot of research going into what's called inoculation. This is a communication strategy of addressing misinformation, and it works kind of like a vaccine works, where if you can give people a weakened dose of that argument and show how it's wrong, then they will build up their defenses ahead of time, and then when they hear the full version of that out in the wild, they'll be much better at defending it. So there's a lot of communication strategies that try to get ahead of things and say, okay, you're probably going to hear this thing out there in the world, and actually that's not true. You hear it for these, and these reasons, and that helps to defend people against this ahead of time, by building up that immunity to those kinds of arguments.
That's what's up.
Yeah.
Yes, please, Angela.
I have a question for Amy. So I just read a really good Cincinnati Magazine article about your work here in Cincinnati, measuring methane emissions of the street lamps, the gas lamps, traditional gas lamps. And it's striking me during this conversation that, at least in that retelling, there's just like a lot of the ingredients of the recipe that you all have been talking us through, like connection to like our community, kind of implicitly a range of options, because it's not like Cincinnati needs to get rid of its historic street lamps, right? But it kind of talks about some of the options as well as drawing the connections with other roles of natural gas, etc. I was just wondering if you would say a little bit about that project, because it's really cool, and then maybe something about if there are particular things you can tell us about your motivation in choosing to do that. Like, when I heard that you were doing that project, I think when I reflect on it, I was a little surprised. I was like, Amy's this fancy scientist, she measures methane all over, and here she is like focusing specifically on gas lamps in Cincinnati.
I don't think of myself as a fancy person. Sure, yeah. So the project that you're referring to is actually, Angela gave me some money for it through her organization, so thank you. So Cincinnati, turns out, has over 1,000 natural gas street lamps. I counted them myself and made a map, which I can share with all of you. And they're from the late 1800s, so they've been burning since then. And they burn 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they use natural gas. So, and that's, as I mentioned, they measure methane emissions from the oil and gas supply chain. And thought it was a kind of an interesting project to do with students from UC, since many of them are in the Clifton area where our campus is. Not as many as I thought. There are more in other neighborhoods than I thought there were after we made the map. So, yeah, just kind of grew out of my previous work in documenting legacy wells, oil and gas wells. So one thing I've worked on in the past, and I still do, is measure methane emissions from old oil and gas wells. Normally, if I was giving a presentation with a visual aids, I would show like a picture of Jed Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies, like that era of oil and gas wells. So a lot of those wells, millions, 3 to 4 million, are still on the landscape in the United States. And many of them are still emitting methane to the atmosphere. And I've worked with legislators to get cleanup funds in federal law, in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So I just thought maybe that measurements can lead to remediation at the other end of the supply chain too. So that's
Can
was the
you
motivation.
talk a little bit about how your students reacted to this information? Where some of them saying, "Oh, we've got to shut those down and make them LED," and then others said, "You know, that's part of the character of our city. You can't remove them. It's not worth it."
I mean, we don't have any say over whether they get shut down or not. Like, we're not in
Right.
charge of the street lights, just to be clear. I think most of the students are surprised at how old they are and, you know, that they use fossil fuel, especially that they're burning in the daytime, you know, how many there are. By the way, there's 2,000 plus in Boston.
Okay. I'm gonna get right on it.
There actually already is a map for Boston. Yeah.
What kind of significant impact would it make if they were to change those out?
So probably for our city, they're not a big source of methane compared to like a power plant. Since I don't want to get too in the weeds on our methane budget, but Cincinnati has the 8th largest landfill in America. So that's a very, very large source of methane, much bigger than our gas street lamps. But I think the bigger thing is that they're a symbol of many neighborhoods and, you know, just a legacy of oil and gas use. And so
Isn't Rumpke harvesting that natural gas?
maybe
Methane gas?
Yeah.
I thought they-
Some of it.
Some of it gets harvested.
some of it, yeah.
I want to, this isn't specific to anything you're talking about, it's about communication and marketing and everything like that. There's a piece out here by Alberta Sportman called The Crying Indian. Many of you are too young to know this ad, but when we were children, people my age, there was a whole ad campaign called Keep America Beautiful. And it always was, it ended with this statuesque Native American man dressed in Indian outfit with a tear rolling down his eyes. One tear rolling down his cheek. And it was, only you can prevent pollution. This ad was paid for by Pepsi and Coca-Cola. They wanted to have one-use throwaway bottles. The government was trying to make them use recyclable ones that they could do. They put that ad out to convince that it was our problem, one bottle at a time, and not their problem for creating pollution. I want to, it's a very, you know, knowing that, it's like a total whitewashing ad, right? We all bought it hook, line, and sinker as kids, you know, don't litter, don't litter, don't litter. Litter wasn't the problem. I mean, it is a problem, but it wasn't the problem. The pollution was. So, to your point, that was a brilliant commercial, and brilliant. It won all these Clio awards for ads. It was brilliant. What's the inverse of that? How do we reverse greenwashing and turn it back on them in a way that feels like it has that kind of impact for a generation of people. Everybody here my age knows this commercial. It's burned into our retinas. So I'm just throwing that out there. I think I wanted to bring it up as a valuable piece of this collection for this show, but also just like how do we take that psychology, flip it on its head, and turn it back?
Yeah. I'll go first, and the reason I'll go first is because I want the two of you to answer this question, because I'm going to not answer it because I actually have no idea.
Okay.
So, in fact, I'll do the opposite of answer, which is I'll add more fuel to the fire and say that this is still a really big problem. In 2017, BP, British Petroleum, they launched what they call the carbon footprint calculator. And what it allows you to do is go through, answer a bunch of questions, describe your lifestyle, and then it tells you, what your carbon footprint is, and then it gives you a bunch of ways that, of course, you can reduce your carbon footprint and make the world a better place. And all that sounds really good because it makes BP look like they care a lot about the environment, but of course it's doing this sneaky thing we call individualization of responsibility, where it's putting all of the responsibility on you, the individual, to fix all of the problems when they're in fact creating a lot of them. So yeah, it is a really big problem. We've also been doing research showing that consumers, when they see these kinds of claims, they pretty much just take them at face value and they don't really critique them very much. We just did an experiment last year showing that people don't distinguish between when a company says we're doing a bunch of sustainable things right now versus we promise to do it by 2040. It has the same exact persuasive effect. So companies are able to get away with all the reputational benefits of doing stuff right now just by promising to do it in the future. So anyways, all of that is very unhelpful because I'm not at all giving you a solution to this problem. I'm just telling you that the problem is in fact very bad and I don't know what the secret is.
Kate, Nicole, or Amy?
Well, if April doesn't know, certainly I don't. But just, I mean, the only thing I could possibly say, not as a solution, but social media drives me crazy, but it's a powerful form of communication and spreading information. And it sounds like one of the issues is that companies can do this sneaky thing where they say they're doing one thing, but they're actually at the same time doing something that goes exactly against that. And it sounds like one of the problems is when people don't know about that. And so this is kind of a silly answer in some ways, but I think mobilizing some of these communication resources that we have to spread the word could be one way of sort of counteracting some of this. As a young person.
They do say, hey, those companies, with your pocketbook, so buy sustainably, and also, politics is so important, so call your politicians and everything. My background is in fine arts, and then my master's work is in conservation biology, so right, so all this stuff you guys are talking about is so important. And the reason I started my master's degree was to find out how to get people to care, Art is a really good way because it touches the left and right side of the brain, so that emotional aspect, inspires action more than a lot of other things. Interpreting science is really important, people that understand both sides. So that they can talk to normal people with the information that scientists, understand. So anyway, thank you guys for everything you're doing. I just want to talk to all of you more. And it's awesome.
So, unless there's a burning question, we can take it over to the cocktails and talk to each other there.
Because they were working.
Yes.
So some of the research I did right away was also religion. I was that's such an important part of so many people's lives around the world. So we can get religion on board. That's another one. I did research on video games. People just see someone cutting down a tree. They're like, man, but if they have to they're in VR and they have to cut it down themselves, it's more emotional. So so there's all these ways just getting getting them out there, you know, the audience.
For sure.
Well, I did want to leave you with one quote from a rock star. Something Joan Baez said in the 60s in the anti-war movement. And there was a lot of despair at that time too. And a quote of hers that's lived on is, "The antidote to fear is taking action." So whatever that means for you, to take some kind of action to respond to this, to get control, even in your own little sphere, I think is wise. It's proved effective in my life, and I hope it would for you.
Real quick, if
Yeah.
I could, because we do advocacy and try and get individuals to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So, do you all have, if you were to tell someone that, like, what's the most important thing I could do in my lifestyle that's gonna make a difference?
Become a vegetarian.
Vote.
Well,
For me, I would say talk about it.
Yeah, talk to people about it, I agree with that.
yes.
Yeah, can I just make one other comment that I think that one thing that would motivate people are examples of success. You know, nothing breeds more success than success itself. So if in your conversations with whoever you're having them with, really, whether it's politicians or neighbors or Mobil Oil, but particularly with individuals, if you can articulate that having done this translated into a benefit, and we do that all the time in the health space, right? You exercise more. Oh, I started working out and my cholesterol came down, so I'm gonna keep doing that. That's a good thing, right? So I think we need to identify, in the same way that we move the needle only this much, we need to come up with examples of incremental successes that people can embrace and feel like, okay, I'm gonna do this, and oh, look at that, after a month, holy cow, it made a difference, and so I'm gonna keep doing it. But I think that personalizes it in a way that allows you to embrace it and kind of get connected emotionally and can be much more successful.
For sure.
Yeah. To get off on a tangent, but the story behind John Sabra's work is a really good example of incremental change that, you know, through his art, through what he did, really changing things in eastern Ohio. Because the pigments that he created were taken from waste.
Oh, the acid mine
Yeah,
drainage?
yes, yeah, and then he's found a way to, with working with other scientists, found a way to make pigments for artists out of those rare earth toxic minerals, which a lot of pigments are toxic. But then the creeks are getting cleaned up and they're alive again. They were completely dead. So that's a really cool story. So having some stories like that to tell people, I think, you know, gives them hope.
Yeah, totally.
Another story I love is about people who have simplified their lives and reported that they're happier, that they have more joy in their life. And I think, especially in America, with our consumption and our competition for more, the pathway to a simpler, more joyous life is really great for the environment too.
Good
Yeah.
point.
Okay.
Also, maybe just to tack on, I like something that Abel said before about how there are certain acts where, like, you know, the act of recycling itself, that maybe doesn't make a huge difference, but through saying I'm a person who recycles, you're kind of making a kind of commitment that I think can be really powerful. So, and I think it takes that kind of people deciding that they are the kind of person that cares about climate change and about the environment and about, you know, their fellow people in their neighborhood or whatever. Even that, you might not be able to count it off, you know,
Yeah.
-2 methane, whatever, but it's like, you know, it sort of becomes this kind of thing. Or that's what I like to think. So I like to think that
All right, well, Paul has recyclable cups here for your cocktails.
And napkins in place.
So we'd like to thank Studio Kroner for this event.